Hello, team players! So, I just got my PDF of Howl the Wild, which means I have brand new options to talk about. And today I want to talk about the Witch. Let's dive in. So first, let's talk about the 3 brand new patrons we got in this book. All 3 of these patrons give you the primal spell list and nature as a patron skill. Let's start with Devourer of Decay. This patron gives you the Scrounger's Glee Hex cantrip and the Enfeeble spell. In addition, whenever you cast or sustain a hex, one creature within 15 feet of your familiar that is at half its hit points or less must make a fortitude saving throw against your spell DC. On a failure, that creature becomes sickened 1. This seems really good to me. I do wish it was sickened 2 on a critical failure, but that's not the case. Unfortunately, this familiar ability is a little situational because the target has to be at half its hit points or fewer. So you're not going to be able to use this all the time. But this is a good way of allowing your party to take down an enemy quickly if it's at below half its hit points, which honestly isn't that bad. However, what makes this familiar ability better is the hex cantrip you get from this patron, Scrounger's Glee. Target one creature within 30 feet who must make a will saving throw. Should the target fail on their will save, they are frightened 1, or frightened 2 on a critical failure. This frightened condition cannot be reduced below 1 as long as the spell is active and the target can hear you. You can also dismiss the spell as a reaction whenever an ally critically hits the target. Doing so heals them for 1d4 hit points at first rank and every 2 ranks after. Honestly, the first part of the spell is pretty amazing. The second part isn't great. I would much rather keep this spell going than heal an ally for 1d4 hit points. Plus, an ally has to critically hit against the target to even dismiss the spell to get that. However, making the target frightened 1 is really good, and keeping them at frightened 1 as long as you sustain the spell is very, very good. Now witches don't even need an unholy champion in order to keep an enemy frightened for a long time. They can just use this spell on them. Plus, this combined with your familiar ability means you can sicken one target and frighten another. I highly recommend this patron. The second patron we got in this book is Ripple in the Deep. This gives you the Sting of the Sea hex cantrip and either Dizzying Colors or Grease as a spell. In addition, whenever you cast or sustain a hex, one creature within 10 feet of your familiar is pushed back 5 feet. This is more than likely going to be considered a shove, which is forced movements, which means this isn't going to trigger reaction. However, this is a great way of pushing enemies away from you or your familiar, or pushing them into hazards in the environment. Now let's talk about our hex cantrip, Sting of the Sea. This allows you to create a portal through which a tentacle of some kind comes through. This wraps around the target's face, hampering its vision. The portal follows the target around, and the tentacle cannot be attacked or harmed. As long as the spell is active, the target must make a fortitude saving throw at the beginning of each of its turns. Should it succeed on the saving throw, the target takes a -2 penalty on all its perception checks until the end of its turn. Should it fail, the target becomes dazzled until the end of its turn. Should it critically fail, the target becomes blinded until the end of its turn. This has quite a few applications. First of all, you can use this out of combat in order to get past a guard or something. But it's really good in combat. As well, allies can't really take advantage of these conditions because it only lasts until the end of their turn. What it does do is make it harder for enemies to see and therefore attack anyone in the party. It also means that even if they're seeking something like a rogue or a ranger that wants to be stealthy, they're going to have a hard time finding them. I do like this patron, I just don't think it's as good as Devourer of Decay, as it's only insane if you've got a rogue or a ranger that wants to be stealthy in the party. At least the spell is only insane in that situation. But the pushing enemies further away from your familiar is honestly pretty good. The last patron we got in this book is Whisper of Wings. This gives you the Murmuration Hex cantrip and the Gentle Landing spell. Also, when you cast or sustain a Hex, your familiar can fly up to 15 feet even if it doesn't have wings. This movement does not trigger reactions. This familiar ability is really good if you want your familiar to deliver touch spells. Otherwise, you may be better off picking a different patron. And with the Murmuration spell, you can target one creature within 30 feet who must make a will saving throw. When you cast this spell, you can also designate one other creature within 30 feet of you. This can include yourself. Once per round, if the target moves closer to your designated creature, they must make a will saving throw or take 1d4 piercing or sonic damage. This is essentially a basic save, except that on a critical failure, the target takes 1d4 of both types of damage, and if it attempts a attack roll or hostile action against the creature you designated, it takes a -2 penalty on that roll. Honestly, this patron might be worth it just for this spell, as this spell does give enemies a reason not to attack the creature you designate, which can include yourself, or any other creature that doesn't want to be attacked. I like this patron as well. But that familiar ability is a little situational. It depends on what type of character you're playing, whether you'll take this patron or not. But we got more than just 3 new patrons in Howl the Wilds. We also got 3 new lessons and some new witch feats in this book. I'm going to start with the 3 new lessons. Starting with Lesson of the Shark. You gain the Blood in the Water Hex, and your familiar learns Feet to Fins. For 2 actions, if the target is taking persistent bleed damage or your last action dealt slashing damage, you can target one creature within 30 feet who can bleed. They must make a basic reflex saving throw. This spell summons shark spirits. When you cast the spell, and each time you sustain it, the target takes 2d6 spirit damage. If the target takes any damage from this spell, all water is treated as difficult terrain for it. The spectral sharks don't take up space, grant flanking, or have any other attributes a creature would. In addition, every time you deal slashing damage to the target, you automatically sustain this spell. At the end of the day, this is just damage unless the target is in water. Plus, it's pretty situational because they have to be taking persistent bleed or you have to have done slashing damage during your last turn, which means some witches are not going to be able to use this very effectively. However, if you are in water, this is especially good, as it makes it harder for enemies to avoid the sharks. And it slows them down, making it harder for them to get to you and your allies. Great spell in the right situation, but otherwise pretty situational. Next we've got the Lesson of Decay. Your familiar learns the Mycological Malady Hex and the Insect Form spell. With Mycological Malady, you attempt to inflict the target with a disease. The target must make a Fortitude saving throw. Non-incorporeal undead, such as skeletons and zombies, don't have their normal immunity to this disease. This might also apply to other non-living creatures made of organic material, depending on the GM's discretion. Things like a flesh golem, for example. On a successful saving throw, the target is enfeebled 2 for 1 round. Should the target fail on their saving throw, they are inflicted with void cap spores at stage 1. Should they critically fail, it's at stage 2. This disease ends when the spell ends. However, stage 1 is enfeebled 2. Stage 2 is enfeebled 2 and slowed 1. Stage 3 is enfeebled 2, slowed 1, and stupefied 2. All these stages have an onset time of 1 round. This spell is flat out amazing, especially against strength-based enemies. The sad part is, if it's a strength-based enemy, more than likely it's going to have a high fortitude save. But witches do eventually get legendary in their spell attacks and DCs. But even if they succeed on their saving throw, they are enfeebled 2 for 1 round. But this really helps because a lot of strength-based enemies do really good damage with their strikes. And this lowers their accuracy, which is very good. And if they do happen to get the disease and make it to stage 2, they're also slowed 1. And slowed is one of, if not the best debuff in this entire system. Flat out amazing spell here. And the spell you get from this lesson isn't bad either, as that will allow you to be in melee with enemies. Honestly, very good lesson here. And lastly, for lessons, we have Lesson of the Flock. You gain the Sheltering Wings Hex, and your familiar learns Levitate as a spell. Sheltering Wings is a reaction that's triggered when an ally moves within 15 feet of you or takes an action with the move trait. You target that ally who must be within 15 feet of you. Your familiar flies up to 30 feet, but it must move towards the triggering ally. If the familiar ends its movement adjacent to the triggering ally, it lands on its back. Until the beginning of your next turn, your familiar moves with that ally and provides it cover. When the spell ends, the familiar hops off your ally and lands in an adjacent square. I'm assuming that the familiar grants them standard cover, as it actually doesn't say what type of cover they get. It just says cover. And standard cover is a +2 to their AC, which isn't bad at all. I definitely like this hex as well, because this can work on any ally. The rogue can use that cover to hide, and imagine giving this to a champion that doesn't use a shield, or any spellcaster, assuming that this is standard cover, which I think it is. And remember, if you have standard cover, you can use the take cover action to gain greater cover, which is a +4 to their AC, which is downright stupid good. Highly recommend this lesson as well. Now let's talk about the 3 feats that we gained in Howl the Wild. Starting with Scatter Swarm. Once per round, if your familiar shares a space with a swarm, that swarm takes damage equal to the swarm's weakness to area damage. You choose what type of damage this deals from either acid, cold, electricity, or fire damage. Honestly, I don't really like this feat very much. You're not going to run into swarms near enough for this feat to be useful. Although I'm pretty sure this would trigger the swarm's weakness to area damage as well. So it is good in that regard. Swarms can be extremely hard to deal with, but you're just not going to run into them very often. But the next feat, Portents of the Harrowspecs, is actually really good. As a reaction, if a creature within 30 feet would be reduced to 0 hit points in a way that doesn't destroy its body, you can make a prediction. This requires you to roll a d12 and compare it to the following table. This determines the damage type favored by your prediction. The next time before the end of your next turn that you or an ally deals that type of damage to an enemy, that enemy has weakness equal to your level to that damage. This is weakness equal to your level. That means at level 10, they have weakness 10 to whatever you roll. This does require a little bit of luck. However, remember that Primal and Arcane Witches can do just about every type of damage on this list. The only ones they can't really do are mental damage and the physical damage types. But those can be easily covered by other classes in your party. A Bard will easily cover the mental damage, and any Marshal can cover all of the physical damage types on this list. Which effectively means if you have the right party, it doesn't matter what you roll. You will always be able to take advantage of that weakness. And it's a big weakness that just gets bigger as you level up. This is by far the best witch feat I've seen for Primal and Arcane Witches. If you get to level 4, you should immediately take this feat. Especially if you're a Primal or Arcane Witch. And lastly, we have Wild Witches Armaments, which requires Witches Armaments. You gain additional effects depending on what unarmed attacks you picked for Witch's Armament. If you took the feat multiple times to gain additional unarmed attacks, you gain all appropriate additional effects from this feat. For Eldritch Nails, if you hit with 2 consecutive nail strikes against the same enemy, that enemy takes additional slashing damage equal to half your level on the second strike. For Iron Teeth, if you critically hit with your jaws, the target must make a Fortitude saving throw or become sickened 1. This is against your class DC. For Living Hair, you gain a Quill's ranged unarmored attack that deals 1d4 piercing damage with a range of 15 feet. The Quills are in the Dart weapon group. I don't really like this feat, and there's a few reasons why. First of all, 2 of the options are just damage, which I really don't like options that just do damage. The only one that is good is the Iron Jaws. However, because it requires a fortitude save, which a lot of enemies have high fortitude saves, and it goes off your class DC and not your spell DC, that makes it not near as good as it could have been. Your class DC is just going to be way lower than your spell DC, which means unless you're going up against lower leveled enemies, you're not going to get that sickened condition very often, which makes this feat not great. Alright, I know you guys are waiting on the ancestries, and I will get to that eventually. However, I'm going to be dividing that up with the local disaster tour guide, and he's not available until after PaizoCon. But I'm sure between the 2 of us, we're going to be able to cover those ancestries pretty well. So you guys can look forward to that. But until then, I'm going to be covering all the other options you have in this book, such as the new spells that are in this book, as well as the new feats and abilities for a few other classes. I will be trying to put out 3 videos per week for this, however. So you guys can definitely look forward to that. In the meantime though, if you liked this video, go ahead and leave a like and do all the other YouTube stuff. And if you like the patrons in this video, you may want to check out this video here for what I think are the best primal spells in this system. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, teamwork is vital. It helps us solve problems.